Okay. All right. I'm live. I've never done this. Okay. Hey, everybody. Um, been working quite a bit recently with Ray, one of my students here at NTU, and we've been talking a lot about anatomy and a lot about just drawing in general. And of course, drawing isn't just anatomy. And I feel like Frank Frazetta is a really good example of that. And we've just been finding references of different artists that do a good job of how to think about anatomy and give a good example of how maybe to represent certain things or conceptualize certain things. And he's so good at that. So there's a couple of books here, clean off my drawing tools. Um, and we have the Icon book, which is a great publication. It has a ton of Frazetta's work. It has some of his sketch work and some of his finished work, and like this, for instance, is like fairly sketchy. Some of his illustration work and some of his personal work and some of the process work. It's all really useful stuff to see. But when I look at anatomy, I tend a lot of times to uh, really value the sketch work, like the unfinished work. Sometimes this finished work is so complicated and polished that it kind of like hides the trick in a way, where the sketch work you can sometimes see how things have been developed and how things kind of progress. And there's a lot of language in this that's like really useful to begin to start to understand how to lay out anatomy or proportion or something like that. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at a book like this, the Rough Work book, which has a lot of Frazetta's sketches in it. That's what it's about. That's why it's called Rough Work, right? So when we page through this, we see a ton of his sketch work that may have been turned into illustrations, may have been just for concepting or whatever. But there's a lot of really good stuff in here. And if you look really closely at these pages, you can find like a lot of just, in these quick sketches, a lot of ways in which he shorthands and then later develops, how it is that he's going to lay out a figure. And so even here, you can see like this is more of a composition design with like a lighting, value structure laid into it. Whereas here he went into that a little bit more and seemed to be more interested in how to like anatomically break down this figure with that same lighting structure in mind. And then here he adds color to it, like all in the sketch work before the finished piece. So it's all really, really, really useful to look at. Even something like this that's super generalized, right? Like these. Bring this a little closer to the camera. Like these shapes are so kind of generic in a way. Like these are not really good anatomical shapes, but they show a kind of a rhythm, a way in which that he's looking at how these shapes are kind of interacting with each other. So instead of maybe looking at these dark shapes, if you look at the light shapes instead, and you see like, for instance, this like kind of question mark shape that's made by by exclusion, right? Like this is all dark and this is what's in the light. And so you see this really actually very complicated question mark shape, which is really beautiful. And then you see that kind of here, maybe this isn't quite a question mark, or maybe it is with this little dot down here, but it's like you see him using this kind of way of describing complicated forms, right, as they just make their way down into other anatomical forms, trying to get the reflection off of that on the camera. So it's like it's very simple there, and it's the basis of his kind of the way he goes through anatomy, right? And you can see it, even something like this obviously is quite different, right? He's totally approaching this differently, and something like this is even more different, right? And how the approach is. But sometimes if you learn to look at the positive form, right? Like instead of the dark marks, look at the light shapes, right? Like what are the big shapes here that are left over? That can be a really important part of being able to see anatomy. And so action packed, so simple. Like this is a real kind of goal, is to how do you create such action, create such excitement with so little information, right? It's a really beautiful little composition there. and I love Frazetta. Frazetta, like me and Frank Frazetta don't have too much in common in terms of what we draw, but one of the things that I always really liked about him is this kind of like slumped posture. You know, like I'm a person who, rather than the kind of like proud and chest forward and shoulders back kind of hyper masculine, I always liked how he rendered out the kind of strength in this figure, but clearly focused on this kind of bad posture and this kind of like quirky finger alignment and stuff like that. Everything has a lot of character to it. I really appreciate that. There's a bunch of times when he's working like that I really enjoy it. So something like this, it's like really interesting how he conceptualizes the back of the leg here. And this is something we always talk about in anatomy class, how there's like three parts to the leg. Well, there's many parts to the leg, but there's the upper leg, the lower leg, and then there's sort of the knee area here. And you see how he's like kind of emphasized this what's called like a lubricating pad in the back of your knee there, and when the knee creases, it creases right across that. So a lot of times there's a little line across there, but see how he's kind of emphasized that moment because the knee is kind of a bit dislocated back. So you have this great gesture back, and then this transition straight into the straight of the leg, and that's a really beautiful like action. And you can see all the parts kind of integrated there really nicely. We'll talk more about that later when we look at some good Frazetta legs. These are fantastic, like gestural studies of legs. I really like this sketch a lot. Just the foreshortening of these legs, and then how this leg kind of interacts with the ground. How he makes sure to kind of like turn the legs interestingly, and we see a lot of anatomy books now that focus on the kind of like interlocking and geometric. And he's someone who really Frank Frazetta is someone who really integrates, a lot like George Bridgman, integrates like a kind of quick and clever drawing style, but still maintaining that kind of structure. Like you can see really clearly the rectilinear nature and that kind of like wrench grasping of the ankles here. And you can see that this foot here is almost like a slipper in a way. It's not a very articulate foot. But it's really quite beautifully done. It tells you everything it needs to tell you, at least in a sketch like this. Really gorgeous stuff. So before I just rattle on too long, maybe I will go ahead and get to the drawing part of this, which is like kind of the fun part. But excellent book. It's well worth picking up something like this. And if you can forgive Frank Frazetta her like super obvious phallic references and like all of the kind of atrocious gender dynamics there, if you can forgive him that and look at the drawings, then I'm not blind to those parts of Frank Frazetta either. But he's still a person quite worth looking at his composition design and anatomy, right? And anyway, so let's look at some of these drawings here. So we printed out some here, and let's take a look at some interesting parts of these drawings. Let's see what we got here. So one of the things that I wanted to make note of, which I think shows up a lot, is this kind of like profile view. And if we start flipping through Frazetta enough, we'll see a lot of this, particular profile view of the figure, and how it is that it, at least in Ling, anatomical design, right? And you can see that these like 1, 2, 3, 4 mounds, they're all different shapes, they're all different sizes, and they're all doing slightly different things, but they're all kind of like generally moving in should have prepared my mechanical pencils more carefully, but they're all kind of moving in this let's see, do I have lead there? I know, thanks, Ray. Ray's giving me a pencil, handing me a pencil like a good friend. So they're all kind of like moving. They're forms that are moving in this way, and so this one underneath does a good job of coming like from behind, right? Which is what the external oblique does, right? So at its simplest, what Frazetta is doing there is he's got the rib cage being this, and then the external oblique being this, and then the pectoralis on top of that being that. And while the anatomy and the arrangement of those things are pretty complicated, and it definitely helps to be aware of it. The way in which he arranges these is pretty simple, and I'm not sure that they're entirely observed. I wouldn't be so bold as to claim that I know, how he's working here. I don't know if he's working from photographs or if he's just working from invention or what. But the way in which these are coming together have a great kind of like naturalism to them, in that they're moving parts, right? So you know, I don't always know how to talk about naturalism or realism with my students, because I definitely don't mean photography when we talk about this, right? Like, what we mean is, how do we create something that's really convincing, right? How do we create something that feels like life? And in order to make a person feel realistic, you have to make that person look like they can move, like they're activated, right? Like they're vital. And so, that's one of the things that Bridgman is really good at. That's one of the reasons Bridgman's such a famous anatomist, is because his line work and the way in which he just draws, and then the way in which he conceptualizes these kind of anatomical forms are very vital, right? Like they're really moving. So the kind of focus on that here is pretty interesting to me, and you can find this, like I said, a lot, and you can see sometimes, especially we'll take a look at some pen and ink work too, and the pen and ink work really emphasizes this, because he'll bring the lines in what's called like a cross contour way. So when he draws his ink lines, here he's painting, so there's not lines, there's just tone and hue, right? Color and value, lightness and darkness and color. But when he's working in pen and ink, he has to, in order to create tone, he has to draw lines, and he draws those lines a lot of times like in a cross contour way, which shows you how he's thinking about building up the forms. And so there's a lot of information. Like, one of the things that's really cool about Frazetta is that he just packs a lot of like really good, really energetic information into like really simple shapes, like really simple little active moments. Um, and it's definitely not easy stuff to do. And it's really, really gorgeous and kind of magnetic. I always really enjoyed it. It's easy to like, I think, a Frazetta image. Pretty nice little designs in there. And let me see if I can just flip through some of these and see if I can find some examples even of that profile view. I know there's like this is an example again. If we take a look, let me get that into view if I can. So if we take a look at this one, we see that same kind of profile view. Obviously it's a bit of a different pose, but one of the interesting things here is that, and let me just contrast that with something really quick. So, okay, so here in this image, right, we see this guy's back really close up to the picture plane here, and all of these lines that have been drawn to make all the bumps and lumps of the back are all made like along the cylindrical plane, right? So if we imagine, a cylinder in space, so if we come back to our drawing here, drawing space here, and we just draw like a big fat cylinder in space like this, right? And so that's like this guy's back is like a big cylinder in space like that. And all of the marks that have been made are whether they're a lump or a bump or what, they're all traveling along this cylinder back in space like that. So that's like this back here. Every single mark that's made along these is made along that cylindrical line. So that's a cross contour line. So if we contrast that with this, for instance, like this kind of figure and profile, you see that that's not the case, right? Because first of all, there's not a whole lot of foreshortening in here like there is in that back, but there's some, and he could run the lines of this like sort of along the rib cage there, but he doesn't, right? He runs them this way. You can see all the lines are built up that way, and that's to create an action, right? It's to create a kind of directionality in the composition that brings you down and into. And so here you can see he's more concerned with. I mean, it's hard to say what he's concerned with here. Like if we take a look at this character right here, you can see that the lines are following the cylindrical form like they were previously, but maybe that's not really Frazetta's concern. Maybe his concern here is that those lines kind of pick up the rhythm of that and carry us through, right? And as we carry through the tail, then we have like contrasting rhythm lines here that go in the other direction, so that there's like strong X potential here, right? You see lots of X's in this, right? Everything's like an X pattern, very active X pattern. So how he runs the lines in relationship to that X pattern is not always like so symmetrical, right? So here again, like, these are not cylindrical lines, right? Because if they were cylindrical, they would go like this around the cylinder, right? So he's again picking up that rhythm and creating a contrasting rhythm to something like this, so that the lines are actually developed in a way that stand out from each other. It's really interesting stuff. But yeah, so that again, that profile shape here. Let's see if we can bring this into a good spot. So we have this kind of overall arcing figure. And I think that made that head a bit small, didn't I? Be like that. So I really appreciate, again, like even in a drawing like this that isn't like 100% an anatomical drawing. Like I wouldn't say that that's what this is about, but it has a lot of anatomy in it because it's a person, so you can't quite get away from the anatomy, right? But the way in which all of this stuff interlocks is really gorgeous, right? And you have this kind of spiraling trapezoid shape and this kind of interlocked straight here, down into this big trapezius shape, right? Which is the muscle that wraps under the arm. And so you can always tell like Frazetta knows his anatomy, right? And he likes to, I don't know if show it off is the right word, but it's where it wants to be. And and what I like about Frazetta is that it's like a used anatomy. Like he's not looking for excuses to draw anatomy. He's recognizing when that anatomy like kind of helps his composition, his purpose, and then he like kind of emphasizes it or de-emphasizes it depending on what he's trying to draw or what he's trying to get across. And so like interestingly, what I like about him is that a lot of his poses sometimes are really, really stiff. Like he's really good at drawing action poses, but he's even better, I think, at making stiff poses feel really alive, and the way he does that is with like internal dynamics, right? That's what we were talking about with the line directions before, right? So it's like, how do you get, this lump to be really interestingly interacting with this lump? And if you line them all up, if they all become synchronized and they don't interact in any kind of interesting way, then they won't be active, right? They won't be like interesting forms. So there has to be, ways of drawing and ways of expressing that are not just simply descriptive, but also like interactive. And I think Bridgman would call this like locking and interlocking, or wedging and passing, right? Is like he has a sort of chapter in his human machine book called wedging and passing, and he builds Bridgman builds these kind of architectural forms that interlock with each other. And part of the best toolkit for I think an anatomical drawer to have is to be able to draw like interlocking parts, like spiraling forms that intersect and overlap with each other. And if you struggle with that, if you struggle with getting this thing to pass behind that thing, or getting this thing to look like it's going back in space and around, then you're going to have a hard time with anatomy, because that's all that anatomy is doing, is kind of spiraling and moving and turning and twisting and doing all that stuff. So it's a really important thing. It doesn't always feel like anatomy. It feels sometimes kind of beside the point, but it's really crucial. It's really an important part of establishing something that feels vital, instead of something that feels so dead. So here you see the same thing, like this kind of external oblique form, which occupies a lot of the side. And then you have the external oblique coming up into the abdomen, but most of this and the rib cage has kind of been, shadowed out. Like we don't see a whole lot of that because it's in the dark. But here in, like I said, in the trapezius, we get this big, nice shape. And I always love kind of looking at and analyzing these kind of interlocks and intersections and overlaps. That's really where my mind goes right away, especially when I'm looking at a drawing like this. And there's some tips and tricks, and I don't know, something like rules around the direction of line work, and some people will say it so plainly, like always pull your, if this is your form, pull your lines around that form, and then if you want to darken it, you can go in the other direction. There's really good value in that, but one of the, like I said before, one of the great things about Frazetta is how it is that he balances, like for instance, the need to create this volume, like whatever volume that is, just that shape in space, the need to create that shape in space with, like, for instance, marks like this. Now, if you're following that, can you see that? Let's see if we can get in close enough. So I'm looking at this leg right here and the marks that make it up. Now, if you're following the kind of around the form principle, then your line should go this way. So these lines would actually specifically be undermining the volume of that thing. So here you have lines that are reinforcing the volumes. These lines reinforce the volumes, but these lines go in the exact opposite direction. And so that's really interesting because they're really gorgeous lines. Like they do a lot for that leg. They're really interesting. But they don't do a lot to build up that shape in space. This is not the most volumetric shape, neither is this. So these kind of radiating lines from his calf, they don't do a lot either to make the shape of that more voluminous, right? Like if you contrast it, for instance, with the lines that make up this part of the snake here, like this is a very, very round looking thing, right? We really feel the volume of that. So in a lot of ways, like my instinct, if I'm looking for volume here, would be to wrap the lines around his leg like that. But that's not what Frazetta did here. He literally brought them in like the opposite direction. right? So it would be a little bit like, if you were drawing just a sphere like that, and you wanted to shade in that sphere, it's like, very useful to bring lines like this and lines like this, lines that wrap around the form. But what if we did just exactly the opposite of that, right? Like, what if instead of that, we just brought those lines in the opposite direction, right? And these lines don't do a lot to remind us of the shape, do they? Right? Like they kind of fight against it, and they flatten it in a way. So he's doing that here, but whatever skill level that Frazetta has, that kind of allows him to undermine that principle a little bit here, and be playful with how he's putting down line work. It really shows a level of competence, I guess, that's really impressive. So, and one of the things that I talk with my students a lot about, that I think is really important, is the idea of like understanding the bones. And you can see, like we'll see in Frazetta a lot, here at the knee, this very rectilinear structure. Like here, we just have this very rectilinear structural knee. And that, of course, is the extension of the femur, which comes from the great trochanter here, which connects to the pelvis, right? And I talk in my drawing for animation class, we talk a lot about the great trochanter and the pelvis and how all that stuff relates. Um, and so if you build that connection from this rectilinear point to that rectilinear point, and you kind of describe these things a little bit differently than you describe them, like in the fleshy part, right? Like in the musculature. So if you treat them a little bit differently, then you can get away with a lot, actually. Like you can, because as long as you have the structure of the bone, and it's sort of interacting with the overall mass of the leg, where you go from there, you can really develop and play a lot with your aesthetics and your line works and all this kind of stuff. You don't have to abide by so many rules if you really clearly get, this guy and that guy established. So that's, for me, that's kind of the value of anatomy. Is not that I want to make some like totally anatomical drawing or sculpture or anything like that, but by establishing these things, you allow like kind of action to happen. So another thing interesting to kind of note about Frazetta is like down here in the leg, he has a kind of again, like I believe he studied with Bridgman, so you can see a lot of like little Bridgman motifs in his drawing, and he uh, maybe borrows a bit, or was inspired a bit, or just picked up habits from, or studied from. Not sure the order of all that, but one of the things is this kind of like, like that kind of calf muscle, right? Like this kind of check mark, which isn't, so anatomically accurate, right? Because there's like another muscle called the soleus there that would give another bump. And Frazetta is like totally aware of this stuff, right? Like he's completely knowledgeable about soleus, and you can see it really easily articulated, in many, many, many of his drawings. Like here's an example where from the back view, where this kind of first line of the calf here, this like gastrocnemius muscle here comes up and intersects, but then the soleus is below that, right? So he's well aware of it. Here it's really, really beautifully articulated. These are great lower legs. So it's not that he's never aware of it, or that not that he's ever not aware of it. But in this case, he's just emphasizing that, and you can see it a bit there. It's not like he forgot about it, but it's just not a muscle that he's emphasizing there in order to get the kind of gesture and the directionality down and in, so that foot sort of escaping into the serpent there is, I guess, more powerfully directed in this composition. So it looks like I'm missing a little bit of chest here as well. That little nipple directional that he's got there, quite nice. And this is just a really cool bit of like interconnected line work here that he's just playing around with. And it doesn't quite follow the anatomical principle exactly. Like he kind of loses me a bit on the anatomy here, but you never mind in a Frazetta. It's because it's for the integrity of the design, I guess. So for me, I always like it a little bit more when I see something like that because I see that he's playing with it. It seems quite creative in a way. So here it looks like I've completely whacked out this leg. I don't think I got it quite right. Maybe. See if I can be as cool as him and play with some cool line work here just to fill out this shape. It's like really useful to draw in pen and ink, so that you get comfortable with this kind of quick hatching, so that it's not such an intimidating thing, nor is it always such a long process. It doesn't have to take you 60 hours all the time just to hatch out a form. Something like that. But I really like I said, the kind of emphasis on this big shadow shape in the chest and the separation of this arm here. Really nice. See if we can find another one to take a look at. Yeah, so like this one, for instance, the back of these legs, I think this is the famous Frazetta lady butt, and lots of butts in Frazetta, of course. But this one particularly has just such great strong legs, and I love the kind of machine of this leg. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how that could be kind of drawn like pretty simply and kind of understood pretty simply, because it's really an interesting thing that he's doing there. So the first thing, of course, is that he has this massive, butt shape, and maybe I'll try to draw this a little larger, so you guys can see it better, I hope. Um, so he's got this massive butt shape, right? And it's just this big kind of shape like that. And that shape makes its way up, and how it makes its way up is really important, right? Of course, it's bisected, right? The crease of the rear end is like that. And you can see that she's twisting. And this is something like that. It can be really tempting just to follow the trajectory of this. And a lot of artists will do this, and they'll line up, they'll orient two things as if they're like bending from each other, but not twisting from each other. So the great thing about Frazetta is how effortlessly he can just say, okay, I'm going to just put a twist in here. And because of that, I'm going to make this side a little smaller and this side a little bigger and put some twists in there. And then we've got a twist, right? So this, a little bit more abstractly would look something like that, where the the bisecting of the butt and its intersection with the rib cage shape, the upper torso, totally like not oriented, like they're both bent from each other and twisted away from each other. So that part is really nice. I'm always like kind of admiring how handily Frazetta does that, right? How this center line and this overall shape here just really react really nicely with the lower form. So in terms of the legs, like the first thing is that this rear end, this butt shape is very simple in this drawing, right? It's all connected to the kind of pelvic block. And he, just nicely and kind of simply creates a beautiful little color pattern here with warm and cool, and just creates a kind of, pretty well designed little shadow pattern. And there's like, little cave lady panties there or whatever. Something like that, right? So we don't see too much of the rear end. We just get this kind of insertion of the oh god, what is that called? The sacrum. And then we see that the sacrum, when it turns, it gets like a little highlight there, which is really quite nice. And then it picks up a little bit of the shadow of the area between the erector spinae, where the spine would sit. And then we get a little bit coming in here, and then the rib cage coming from outside there, right? So we get just a quite nice like little design situation. And then we have this leg here coming this way, and this is that nice little interlock I was talking about. So make sure to get the proportion right there, right? Because if your proportion is super important, especially when you're foreshortening something, right? So let me just sketch this out a little better. I don't want to get too confident and then get my proportion completely whacked. So let me just spend a little time there. Make sure I don't make myself the fool. No, that's not right. I think that's too big. Yeah, so something like that. And then, being able to draw out or render out a kind of cast shadow is really important, right? And of course, the edge of a cast shadow is really different than the edge of a core shadow, right? So while they might be the same value or whatever, core shadow is always going to be a lot more diffuse, because it's a shadow that's wrapping around. So those kind of blurred lines, or a kind of like blurred outlines, or just a more diffuse transition is like appropriate. So the difference would be like, of course, this is the cast shadow here. This on the rear end here is a core shadow, right? As is this, right? Because that's the light wrapping around the form. So here we have another cast shadow coming this way, and then that runs into a core shadow, and then another core shadow, right? So the cast shadow has that kind of harder edge, and the core shadow has a softer edge. So when we get down here, this is just a really like beautiful little explanation, like a drawn explanation of the H pattern that the tendons from the muscles in the back of the leg form to sort of like make out this lubricating pad in the back, and the insertion of the gastrocnemius, which is the calf muscle, right? So this big teardrop shape now can slide up and in to that space. And we have these like little, what almost look like, hydraulic press arms or something like that come, and they just make their way and transition into this this lower leg, right? So this mechanism is really important because it shows the kind of like, if we're going to call it a hydraulic press, it shows that machine will work, right? Like it shows you the way that machine will move. So it's really important that you get this kind of interlock here, and you can see how handy Frazetta is with kind of like designing these shapes, right? You see that they're never simple shapes with Frazetta. I mean, that's not true, not never. Sometimes they're simple shapes, but more often than not, he puts quite a bit of effort into designing them, and then the shapes kind of live quite nicely because of that design. So I've always been this is probably the most carefully I've looked at Frazetta for this purpose, but I've always taken a good look, and always been quite inspired when I saw his works. And sometimes the anatomy lines up with the cylindrical form quite nicely, right? So the rib cage, obviously the ribs of the rib cage will wrap around the rib cage itself, right? So these kind of help indicate. But there's a lot of forms that work against that, kind of directionality. So you have to choose, right? Like, how do you represent these forms, or what kind of line work, or what kind of anything goes into how it is that you kind of express one form after the other. And I really love this kind of twist down here in this other leg. We have a really bulky kind of twist going on, and I really appreciate that he's got this kind of like broad musculature here that maybe doesn't, these legs seem quite out of sync with the proportion of the rest of the character, but they work so well. They're just such a strong machine. And I think that's the thing that I've always like kind of hung on to. Is like, as long as you can get the machine to work, then the drawing will work as well. Meaning, like, if you can make a drawing that looks like a machine that works, then you're all set. And so, I love the way that this twists, right? And like, look at this little highlight right there, which is not a very bright paint. It's certainly not as bright as anything like this, but it just separates that twisting form so nicely. I just really appreciate this. And we have all of this under here, all quite dark. Yeah, such nice design there. And could just kind of go on and keep building this for a while. And then we kind of and this is probably, I'm not always in love with, or I shouldn't say that, but like, I wouldn't always choose for myself what Frazetta chooses for his drawings or paintings. So, like, for instance, this kind of shape here, where this shadow comes down, like, now I know why he put that shadow there, because it reinforces the form. It's a cast shadow that shows us better the trajectory of the rib cage, or the orientation of the rib cage. But I don't like this kind of eye shape here. See that kind of like letter I shape. For me, I don't love that, and I would try to like maybe break that up a little bit. And it doesn't seem to be compatible with like how he's designing shapes down here, which is, I mean, listen, I'm not trying to like say that this is a bad painting or anything like that. I'm just, saying if I was going to make this, then I might have chosen something different there. But I really appreciate, like, how he sits the scapula on top of the rib cage there, and how it is that he builds up this kind of head shape, right? He's always really good at that too. Beautiful shapes, always complicated enough, always unique enough. Never looks like he's just making something up. It always looks like he just saw these things just happen in front of him. And he's such a good designer in that way. So in order to develop this a little more, we would be working out the values, right? Continuing to develop the shapes. And another fancy little piece of fabric hanging off the side. Quite, Frazetta quite loves that stuff. Little flourish. Not sure why this warrior has so many bells attached to her waistband. Seems a bit counterintuitive, but who am I to criticize the methods of fantastic warriors from other worlds? But remember, when you're drawing, it helps a lot to like kind of distinguish and silhouette the figure from the background, right? So you see Frazetta did that in kind of stripes here. There's kind of a strong stripe there, a strong stripe here. So when you're working around the figure, like it helps a lot to. Of course, you need reflected light in that case, so that you can continue to see the distinction between the form and the background. And you might have to get darker and darker. I've stayed quite light in this drawing so far, so I think it's not quite dark enough in many ways. But as I continue to develop this, I would keep thinking about my value structure. But anyway, so I think I'll finish there. I think let's see if anybody likes to watch this, or if there's some demand for it, because I think Ray and I are going to look quite closely at a bunch of artists, and we might do it in this way if there's some following for it, or there's some desire for it. So it'd be nice to kind of like share these conversations out a little bit more than just the ones that we're having in the studio. But so yeah, if you watch this and you want to see more, and you found it useful at all, then please do write a comment or something and let me know, because a little encourage, it's like, I mean, I can do this sometimes, but a little encouragement goes a long way to keep stuff like this showing up. So anyway, thanks for watching if you did watch, and